JavaScript ES6, Basic Data Structures. In programming, there are two general categories of values, either a single value or multiple values. Often a single value is needed. This might be the string hello or the number 5. It could be anything else that is a single value. Multiple values can be stored in arrays. This is a very specific type of data structure where the order is important. In arrays, it is a sequence of values, where the order of the values is important. Arrays also start with the position 0, and all subsequent values added to the array are then at index n+1. So if there were two items in the array, they would start with the position 0, and the next would be in the position 1. JavaScript also supports objects. Instead of caring about order, values are stored instead with keys called properties. These exist in a key-to-value relationship, where you use the key, called a property with an object, to access the value. So for arrays, position is important, and their index is how they are accessed within their sequence. For objects, the order is not important, and instead, the properties or the keys to access those values are important. Let's look at an example of an object literal. Here we have objectExample, here defined using open and closing curly brackets, and this is important. All objects in JavaScript use open and closing curly brackets. Similar to how arrays might be defined using a series of values separated by commas, an object literal, in this case, has its properties, again, the keys to access the values, also separated by commas, except they are written in the format of property, a colon, and then the value of that property. So in this case, to access the value, string value, we would use the key firstKey. This is a property of objectExample. When an object and its property are defined like in the previous example, just gone over, this is called, again, an object literal. It is called this because it is the literal definition of the object. We are defining both the object and its properties in one set of code. We are literally defining it. Once defined, objects, like their sister data structure, the array, can have its properties accessed using open and closing square brackets. Both arrays and objects support accessing their internal data using open and closing square brackets. In the case of an array, again, the sequence of data is important. Its order is important. So we access then using the position of the data, otherwise known as its index. Again, as a review, because arrays start with 0, to access the first item, it would be array index 0, and then increasing numbers from there. For objects, we can again access using the keys to the values, or known as the properties to its values. So if we wanted to get the value of the property firstKey, we would use open and closing square brackets and quotation marks around the property we want. Again, because the order does not matter in objects, we're saying, hey, I want the property, in this case, firstKey, in quotation marks, to access its corresponding value within that data structure. Objects also support something called dot notation. Properties can be used after the variable containing the object, a dot, a period, and then the name of that property. So objects support open and closing square brackets, as was covered in the previous slide. But they also support and are more commonly used using dot notation. So in this example, the variable objectExample contains an object, defined previous slide as an object literal, and we're accessing its property using dot notation. So the name of the object, a period, a dot, and then the name of the property to access that key. So again, this is the same as using open and closing square brackets, but it's a little more compact and is more commonly seen. So why would we use an array and why would we use an object? If we care about the order of the values, an array is often the best choice. This might be, for example, information used for a graph in which the order is particularly important when graphing data, or it might be particular increase for some other data set where the order is important and the order matters. Or it could be if the order does not matter, but the properties matter. For example, if we had physics data and we cared about things related to individual measurements, where the measurements themselves and not necessarily the order of the measurements mattered, that would be a case for an object. So if the order does not particularly matter, but the name or the labels of that data matters, an object is the best choice. If the order matters, an array is the best choice. Let's look at some example code in VS Code. So here we have an array defined right here on line 2. Again, with the order mattering, defined using open and closing square brackets, with the values 1, 2, 3, and 4, again in order. Second, we're creating an object literal, again a literal object, defined right here, lines 5 through 8. Object example, in this case using open and closing curly brackets, and then its two different properties, again existing in a key to value format where we use the key, the property, to access the value of that property. Notice I've also introduced right here quotation marks around this, and I'm going to say why I'm doing that here in a moment, but this is important because it sometimes comes up with objects. But let's talk about arrays and then we'll move back to that. So as I mentioned before, to access data within an array where the sequence is important, again, arrays are values in sequence. If we wanted to get access to the first entry, that is the second in order, starting with 0, so 0 and then 1, we would use the array index 1 and open and closing square brackets after the name of a variable containing that array value. So from this array example, we wanted to get access to the first, that is the second in order data, number 2. From line 2, we would use position 1. So value 1 is at position 0, value 2 is at position 1. So to print the first, the second in order entry, we would access it using its array index of 1. Again, with arrays, position matters because it is values in sequence where the order of that sequence matters. Objects, on the other hand, do not care necessarily about order and instead care about the labels, or otherwise known as the properties of the data within its structure. So this is an example of dot notation right here. So we have second property written out right here using a dot notation of a period. So again, matching line 7, this exact thing. We want the value of the string second. We're accessing using dot notation, a period between the name of the object and the name of its property. Matching right here, again, as the overlay is telling us, property, second property, which is a string value. Sometimes, although not as commonly, in ES6, sometimes objects will have properties that have spaces in their names. In these cases, you cannot use the dot notation because variable names cannot contain spaces. Again, as a review of variable names, they can contain letters, numbers, the underscore, and no other special symbols, and especially excluding spaces. So variable names cannot contain spaces, which means properties with spaces in their names cannot be used with a dot notation. In this case, however, we can again return to open and closing square brackets and in quotations the name of the property we want to access that value. Because it is in quotations and is technically a string value, it can contain spaces. So if we wanted to access the property first space property, we would do that using open and closing square brackets and in quotations have the name of the property we want to access. In fact, as the little tooltip tells us, this is the property first space property and is a string. So again, as a review, two different basic data structures within JavaScript are an array where the order of values matters. It is a sequence of values, and we access any individual values within that sequence using its index, using its position within that sequence. For objects, on the other hand, order does not necessarily matter, and instead we care about the properties, the names of that data. And we access them using a key to value format, where we supply the property, the key, to gain access to the value. So we do that using either dot notation right here, using the object and then the name we want to access the property to get to that value, or if we want, we can use square brackets and quotations around that property, and this is particularly important if the properties contain spaces, as variable names cannot contain spaces. And so to access that property, if it contains spaces, we put it in quotation marks, put it inside open and closing square brackets, following the name of the object. This has been a review of the two basic data structures within JavaScript, arrays and objects, paying close attention to object literals.